The wind was a thief, stealing the last of the warmth from the day and rattling the loose planking of the barn. It was a sound Alara had once found comforting, the sturdy groans of a place built to withstand the temper of the plains. Now it sounded like a skeletal thing, mocking the hollow space inside her chest. She knelt in the dusty straw, the world a blur of splintered light and shadow. Her scalp throbbed, a cold, exposed. She didn't need a mirror to see the mark Martha had gouged there with a heated nail file, a vicious crescent moon just below her eye. A brand, they'd called it, for a woman who had brought ruin to their bloodline, for a wife who couldn't keep a husband from a fool accident. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, a physical manifestation of the hatred they had nurtured since Thomas's casket was lowered into the frozen earth. This barn, where she and Thomas had stolen kisses and dreamed of the herd they would build, had been turned into her pillory. A profound, bottomless despair settled over her. This land, this life had been a shared promise. Now, it was just a vast, empty canvas for her grief, and his family was determined to scrape her from it entirely. They had taken her husband, her dignity, and now her identity. The long braid she had worn since girlhood, the one Thomas used to tug playfully, was gone. They had tried to unmake her, to shear away the woman he had loved and leave only a shamed creature in her place. A shadow fell across the open doorway, blocking the anemic light. Alara flinched, her body coiling tight, ready for another blow. But it was not Jedediah's bullish frame or Martha's gaunt silhouette. It was Silas. He stood there, silent as he always was, his presence a solid, unmoving thing against the howling wind. He was the ranch's only hired hand, a man who spoke in clipped sentences and whose past was a closed book to everyone. Thomas had trusted him implicitly. "He reads the land, not people," Thomas had said. "That makes him more honest than most." Silas's gaze, usually fixed on the horizon or the task at hand, took in the scene without visible shock, but a muscle tightened in his jaw, a barely perceptible flicker. He saw the shorn hair on the floor, the rigid terror in her posture. His eyes lifted to her face, resting for a moment on the weeping mark on her cheek. He did not offer. He then turned and walked toward the far end of the barn, picking up a harness that needed mending, the rhythmic scrape of his awl against leather a steady, grounding sound in the echoing silence of her ruin. Alara stared at the bucket, at the clear, cold water that would sting her wound, and for the first time since the shears had closed around her hair, a single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her other cheek. The days that followed were a silent war of attrition. Alara abandoned the main house, a place now poisoned by Martha's simmering rage and Jedediah's greedy, possessive stares. She took refuge in the small line cabin a quarter-mile away, a place meant for itinerant cowboys, not the mistress of the ranch. It was little more than a cot, a stove, and 4 walls to hold back the wind, but it was hers. The cold was a clean thing, honest in its bite, unlike the suffocating warmth of the house where every corner held a ghost and a grievance. She saw them from a distance, moving about the property as if she were already gone. Jedediah riding Thomas's favorite gelding, Martha airing out blankets on the porch rail as if preparing the house for new, proper owners. Each morning, Alara would look at her reflection in the cabin's warped piece of glass. The stubble of her hair was beginning to soften, a dark shadow against her scalp. The angry red of the crescent on her cheek was fading to a purplish scar. At first, the image had filled her with a wave of sickening shame. But slowly, something else began to take root in the barren ground of her spirit. This was not her shame. It was theirs. They had meant to mark her as a broken thing, an outcast. Instead, they had forged her into something new. The mark was a brand, yes, but not of their making. It was her own. It was a reminder, etched in her own flesh, of what had been taken and what she would not allow to be taken again. Silas maintained his quiet orbit. He never approached the cabin directly, but she would find a stack of freshly chopped firewood by the door when the old pile ran low. Once, a brace of rabbits, cleaned and ready for the pot, appeared on her stoop. He spoke to her only of the ranch, his voice low and rough as granite. "North fence is down by the creek," he'd say, not looking at her, his focus on the horizon. Cattle are getting thin on the winter pasture. I'll ride out with you, she said one morning, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. He gave a short, sharp nod, his expression unchanging, but she felt a subtle shift in the space between them. He was no longer just protecting her. He was accepting her as a partner in the work. They rode for hours in a biting wind, the silence between them comfortable, filled only with the creak of leather and the snorting of the horses. She watched his hands, calloused, competent, as he strained wire and reset posts. He worked with a fierce, focused economy, no movement wasted. She worked alongside him, her own hands growing raw, the physical labor a welcome balm for the turmoil inside her. The pain in her muscles was real, earned, and it pushed back against the other, deeper ache. One evening, as a low, bruised sky threatened the first heavy snow, she found him in the barn sharpening an axe blade, the rasp of the stone rhythmic and meditative. She stood for a moment, watching the lamplight catch the sharp planes of his face. He seemed carved from the same hard country they inhabited. "They think I'll break," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Silas didn't stop his work. The stone continued its circular journey over the steel. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice quiet but clear over the sound. "Hard things don't break. They sharpen." He lifted the axe, testing the edge with his thumb, his gaze still fixed on the blade. He looked up at her then, his eyes dark and unreadable. He wasn't offering comfort. He was stating a fact, a law of this land as immutable as the coming winter. In his gaze, she saw not pity for her scars, but an acknowledgement of the steel he saw forming within her. It was then she knew she was not entirely alone in her war. The snow came, a thick, suffocating blanket that isolated the ranch completely. Jedediah grew bolder in the confinement, his resentment festering. He drank more heavily, his voice a constant, belligerent rumble that carried from the main house on the wind. Alara knew a confrontation was inevitable. It was a storm front building on the horizon, dark and ominous. She could feel the pressure dropping, the air growing thick with unspoken violence. She took to carrying a small skinning knife on her belt, its weight a cold, hard reassurance. She and Silas worked to secure the herd, moving them to the sheltered canyon, their days a blur of hard riding and frozen labor. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose, fortifying their world against two storms, the one brewing in the clouds and the one brewing in the house. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, the sky the color of lead. Jedediah had sold a dozen head of cattle to a passing drover, Thomas's prime stock, for a fraction of their worth. He came to the barn reeking of whiskey and self-satisfaction, the silver coins heavy in his pocket. Alara was mucking out a stall, the physical work a way to channel the fury that had been building in her for weeks. "That's the last of it?" he slurred, leaning against the stall door, his bulk filling the frame. "Once the spring thaw comes, you'll be gone. Mama wants this place clean." Alara didn't stop, plunging the pitchfork into the soiled hay with a vicious jab. "This place is mine, Jedediah. The law says so." He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "The law is a day's ride away. I'm the law here." He stepped into the stall, crowding her, his shadow falling over her. He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the scar. "Mama did good work. Marked you for what you are." A curse. Alara froze, the handle of the pitchfork slick in her hands. Every muscle screamed to swing it, to feel it strike home. But she held herself rigid, her breath caught in her throat. This was what he wanted. He wanted her to become the animal they claimed she was. "You'll leave with nothing," he snarled, his face close to hers, his breath foul. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "You'll be begging on a street corner by summer." "Let her go." The voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet it cut through Jedediah's drunken haze like a shard of ice. Silas stood at the entrance to the stall, a coiled length of rope in his hand. He hadn't made a sound. He simply was. Jedediah turned, a sneer on his face. "Stay out of this, Hand. This is family business." He gave Alara's arm a vicious shake. Silas dropped the rope. He took 2 steps forward, his movements fluid and unervingly calm. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten. He just moved into Jedediah's space, a silent, immovable object. "I said, let her go." Jedediah, full of liquor and arrogance, shoved him. It was a mistake. Silas absorbed the push without moving an inch. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, he acted. One hand shot out, grabbing the front of Jedediah's shirt. The other delivered a single, precise blow to the side of his neck. Jedediah made a choking sound, his eyes wide with shock, and collapsed into the hay, gasping like a landed fish. Martha's shriek tore through the air from the direction of the house. She must have been watching. She came running, her face a mask of fury. "You brute! You savage! I'll have you hanged for this!" Silas ignored her, his attention fixed on Alara, checking to see if she was harmed. Alara stood tall, the pitchfork held loosely at her side. The fear was gone, burned away by a cold, clear certainty. She looked at the gasping form of her brother-in-law, at the venomous woman shrieking curses, and then she looked at the quiet, capable man who stood as her shield. The path forward was suddenly, blindingly clear. She would not be driven from this place. She would leave. But she would leave on her own terms, and she would not go empty-handed. She walked past Jedediah's pathetic form and stopped in front of Silas, her gaze unwavering. "Get the supply wagon ready," she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of an unbreakable command. She glanced toward the corral, where Thomas's 2 best horses, a strong calico mare and a slate-gray gelding, stood flicking their tails. "And saddle Calico and Slate." She turned her eyes back to his, locking him in place. "You're coming with me." It was not a request. It was a declaration, a vow forged in the crucible of that barn. They moved through the pre-dawn chill with the silent efficiency of a 2-person army. There was no haste, no frantic scramble of escape. This was a deliberate exodus, a reclamation. While Silas hitched the sturdy wagon and loaded it with sacks of flour, salted meat, tools, and blankets, Alara walked into the main house for the last time. Martha and Jedediah were huddled in the parlor, their rage now curdled into a sullen, fearful silence. They watched her, but did not dare to speak as she went to the heavy oak desk in Thomas's study. She unlocked the strongbox, taking the deed to the property, legally and morally hers, and the thick roll of cash from the cattle sale. She left Jedediah's few silver coins scattered on the desktop, a final, contemptuous gesture. From the mantel, she took her husband's worn journal, and from her old bedroom, a small, velvet-lined box containing her mother's silver locket. These were the only things that held meaning. The rest was just wood and memory, and she would not be a ghost in its halls. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine and the promise of a clear day. Silas was securing the final lashings on the wagon. He had done more than she asked, packing a rifle and ammunition, his own small bedroll, and a heavy cast-iron skillet. He had chosen survival. He had chosen her. As she approached, he looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the yard. In the pale, emerging light, she saw the question in his eyes, not of their destination, but of her resolve. She walked to the side of the wagon and paused, her hand rising instinctively to her cheek. The scar was a part of her now, a raised line of tissue that would forever tell a story. It no longer burned with shame. It felt like a boundary line, the demarcation of a life she was leaving behind and the one she was about to claim. She thought of how the land held memories, how these fields would remember the sound of Thomas's laughter and the sight of her own tears. But she would not haunt this place. A haunting was a thing of stillness and regret. She was choosing motion. She was taking the best of this ranch, its legacy of endurance, the 2 strongest horses, and the one decent man left on it, and leaving the rot to consume itself. Climbing onto the high wagon seat, her spine was straight, her shoulders set. The woman who had knelt broken in the straw was gone, replaced by someone harder, sharper. Her shorn hair was no longer a mark of victimhood. It was the practical cut of a woman with no time for vanities, a woman with a long road ahead. Silas swung up beside her, taking the reins in his capable hands. He didn't ask where they were going. He simply waited. Alara looked ahead, past the familiar fences and the low-slung roof of the barn, toward the vast, open country that stretched to the horizon. The rising sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky in strokes of pale gold and rose. It was a wild, unforgiving landscape, but for the first time in a long time, it did not look empty. It looked like a promise. A blank page. She gave a single, decisive nod. With a soft click of the reins and the gentle creak of leather and wood, the wagon rolled forward, leaving the ranch and its ghosts to shrink in the growing light behind them.